HW, former director of CIA. Do you think it stands to reason that HW might have known more than many other modern presidents by virtue of
I had conversations with him back in 2003, and what he learned, he was not briefed as a president on this subject. He was briefed as an incoming CIA director.
Not surprised.
And that's all he had on it. When he became president, he didn't hear about it anymore. When he was the CIA director, he was given some pretty spectacular information, and he insisted that he wanted to see that. This is DoD information. What's funny is that his agency was the portfolio owner for UAPs, so he wasn't told who in the CIA was running it. For him to get briefed by, for him to call on his phone and say, "I need you to brief me," he wasn't told. Instead, it was the Pentagon liaison officer who had no intention on briefing him about UFOs or UAPs. And instead, he assumed that Bush had already been briefed by his CIA personnel or his leadership,
Sure,
who oversee that portfolio. And he accidentally assumed that. He started rattling off about a major UAP events that took place in the early 60s. And Bush's eyes lit up, and this is what he's told me. He said, "What are you talking about?" So the Pentagon liaison officer told him all about it. He said, "Are you kidding me? There's a there?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Well, I want to see the evidence." And the evidence was in the form of a film, and some documentation, reports or something. But the film was the primary thing. And he was declined. The liaison officer said, "No, you don't have a need to know because this is DoD intelligence, and we're not going to give it to you. Only if there's an event that happens that requires you to take that information up to the president and the national security." Actually, you go to the national security advisor. He's the clearinghouse for all things UAP. So you go to the president's national security advisor, and you say, "My agency just had a major event that we collected intelligence on, and it's going to require a presidential decision." And the national security advisor is going to have to say, "Okay, here's a number at your agency who you're going to call to get a full briefing on the whole UFO thing. And meanwhile, I will schedule a meeting in the Oval Office with the president for you." That's how that works.
Yeah.
And I think the PED documents could possibly emerge from that. If it's a historical thing, no, that historical event might already be covered by a PED. And that's probably why that guy, that briefing officer, the liaison officer from the Pentagon, actually slipped up by wrongly assuming that Bush was already briefed. The fact is yes, you can brief the PED within the executive branch, but he assumed that Bush had been and he hadn't been. So my guess is that since that was not a new event, it was an old historical event, that there'd be no need to brief Bush on the PED that was involved. So he would never know. He would just hear about the evidence that recorded that event happening. And it happened at a military base. And so there you go.
And speaking of those PEDs, yesterday you also made some super interesting comments on kind of private contracts. Specifically, I think you said source contracts.
Sole source. Instead of putting out a project up for a contract bid,
an RFP.
Yeah, you have to issue either a broad area announcement, which is how Bigelow Aerospace applied to submit a bid for the OSAP contract. So it's either a request for proposals or a broad area announcement. And if you do that, then you're going to severely compromise the security of an SAP. So they don't do that. You don't invite different companies to see the specs of the program, the outline and the specs and the deliverables expected over the period of performance expected in the RFP or the BAA. Instead, the government agency has the contract guy and the program manager guy and maybe one other authority over all that. They're gonna call up their favorite contractor who they know or believe could successfully execute the project. And they'll say, "Okay, we want to give you a contract. Here's how much money and here's how many years we're going to pay you." And the company's stupid, they'll say no. If the company's smart, they'll say yes. And generally, the Beltway bandits and the legacy aerospace industry are not stupid. They need money, so they will always say
Would
yes.
those be authorized contracts then, or have a transfer of authority? Those sole source contracts, would they be traceable?
No, usually they set up a front company to pass the money through.
So this roster of kind of the big defense contractors for these big projects, would that roster be pretty thin? Only a couple entries there, and
I don't know. I do know from the aerospace company that I interacted with quite frequently during the OSAP. They did go to the government customer. It wasn't always the CIA. It was Air Force at times. So I think the money is transmitted through a pass-through company, but they know very well who their government customer is. The government customer knows very well who they are and that they have a contract. So I think the fact that the money goes through a hard-to-audit channel doesn't prevent the two from talking, because the program does get contract monitoring and contract oversight from the government customer. So they will exert that authority over the.
I wanted to ask you about Dave Grush's IRAD fraud allegations. You recall what he talked about in Congress? He alleged that at least one contract, and I believe Elizondo repeated it in his House hearing. The allegation was made that at some point in time, for some duration, a contractor artificially inflated the proposal budget for a black budget program so that they could siphon that money off into IRAD to do an IRAD project, because frequently you can tax deduct the funding from the profit dollars and move them. And instead of just hoping they overperform, they doctored the situation so that they definitely overperformed, and the extra money was sort of moved into this.
Okay. I don't have any insights on that. Okay. And there are two types of contracts. It's either cost plus fee or fixed cost,
right?
Fixed firm price. Yeah. So those are the only contract vehicles I'm aware of. I'm not aware that there's anything special just because of UAPs. So it's either cost plus or firm cost.
Sure.
Firm fixed price.
Sure.
Yeah. One of those is how NASA tends to issue contracts. Like Artemis is way over budget, over schedule, and the Orion heat shield did the same thing to the Orion. Boeing has become a disaster with the CST-100 or this. What was it?
Starliner.
Starliner. Yes.
Yeah.
So that is under cost plus.
Right.
And that's where the government gets screwed on. So I have no idea what contract vehicles are used for UAPs. It's like now you're down in the weeds and it really doesn't matter. So.
Sure.
Speaking of these sort of corporate entities here, people are sort of aware that, okay, maybe they have their groups to do the field engineering, to do the material analysis, what have you, in their programs. But is there any merit to there being private strike teams who are having their own contested crash recoveries with the public strike teams?
No, I'm not familiar with any. I haven't heard any such thing, even out in the open. And even in the classified venue, I haven't heard.
There's a story of apparently a private military contractor, contracted by Lockheed Martin, sent out to recover a crash, and a JSOC team sent out to the same crash site. And they're apparently being exchange of fire and KKAs. And, clearly this would generate a lot of paper, right?
Wow, I'm not familiar with that incident.
Yeah.
So all this talk about private contractors, the big Lockheed Martin, what about federally funded research and development centers such as MITRE, RAND, Triad, Oak Ridge, and UARCs, university affiliated research centers? Where do they fall into this?
Only one, and I won't name it, started out as a contractor in the 1960s, starting not too long after it was born. It's actually a spinoff of TRW. So TRW was the principal investigator for the first roughly, almost 30, practically, 29 years. But I know that another company would dispute that. They thought they were a principal contractor. In fact, the principal contractor serves a leadership role that the other companies kind of, they don't know what's going on, but they know who's involved at the, the scuttlebutt level. And so they know at the scuttlebutt level through communications with the government customer, who else would be involved. But they don't have direct communications with those other companies because of compartmentalization. So I do know that there'd be a dispute because there was, the senior VP of the company I interacted with during the OSAP would thought, well, we had the program running and they didn't consider somebody else as the principal investigator, I think they would know that. The government customer knows that. So I think that's where the misunderstanding was occurring, is down at the company level. So yeah, the only FFRDC I know of is the one that spun off of TRW. My recollection from the senior vice president of the other company is that they kind of left that whole line of work at some point, just because I think they did all they could do. And so they got out of it somewhere maybe 10 a little more years after they got started on it. So probably in the early 70s is when they left it. And then we had the other legacy firms that were involved. So there were 4 overall.